Look me in my eyes right now and tell me this isn't the cutest embroidered bag you have ever seen. Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Han and I'm a hand embroidery artist. Today's video is going to be a super beginner friendly embroidery tutorial on this Trader Joe's mini tote bag. I'm currently in the middle of editing a super long and complicated bookbinding embroidery project video, but when this came in the mail, I had to drop everything, put everything on pause, embroider this and show you guys how to embroider your own as well. Before I hop into the supplies you'll need to complete this project at home, I would just shamelessly love to remind you to subscribe if you love embroidery content. I do make a lot of small business related content as well, but I do really enjoy filming beginner friendly embroidery tutorials, and as of recording this tutorial I am 3 watch hours away from becoming a monetized YouTube channel. That's just so wild to me. Thank you so much to everyone who has been watching and following along. Don't forget to like this video and maybe share it with somebody who also might like to do this project at home. Okay, so first up you're going to need some embroidery needles. I always recommend these needles. They come in a pack of 30 with a bunch of different lengths and eyelet sizes. You can't really go wrong. I think they're about $4 on Amazon, but really any embroidery needles you can get your hands on will do. As always, I will have all these supplies linked in the description of this video. Next up, you'll need a pair of scissors. You don't need to go out and buy a special pair of scissors for this project. I like mine relatively small and sharp so I can get as close to the embroidery as possible. Next up, I do recommend finger protectors for this project. The material of this Trader Joe's tote bag isn't super thick, but it is a little thicker than other embroidery materials like cotton or linen, and you just want to protect the skin on your fingertips. I've been wearing these finger protectors now for years in almost every single embroidery project that I do, but even now the skin on my index and my middle finger on my right hand is kind of damaged from all the years where I didn't wear these finger protectors, so I 100% recommend these for every single project. Next up, you're going to need some kind of embroidery marker. I love this embroidery marker. I use the blue side and it disappears when it comes into contact with water. I kind of freehanded this design. I wasn't sure what elements I wanted to include, so using the blue side of this pen gave me some freedom when I was sketching out the design. It's really forgiving and it's a great way to transfer a design onto something that you're going to embroider. Next up, you'll need some embroidery thread. I always recommend the cheaper non-brand name embroidery thread as opposed to, let's say, DMC thread, especially if you're first starting out, because DMC thread can get really expensive. The thread that I'll have linked in the description comes with something like 140 different colors, and it's actually much higher quality than you would expect for the price. Next, you might want to use an embroidery hoop for this project. I personally am not going to use one, but especially if you're a beginner, using an embroidery hoop is really great to avoid any issues with the fabric bunching, so I would recommend using an embroidery hoop if you're a beginner. Next, you will need something to store your needle in when you are not embroidering. You might anticipate finishing this project in an afternoon, but if you are planning on taking breaks, you will need somewhere to keep your needle. And lastly, you are going to need a tote bag. Right now, you can get these Trader Joe's mini tote bags on eBay for around $12, but I did hear rumors that they are restocking in stores, and I think they sell for something silly like $2 to $3 directly from the store. So if they do restock, go and grab one. These bags are so cute and they're really good quality. I was not expecting it at all. Okay, so once you have your bag and all of your materials gathered, it is time to start sketching out your design. I decided that I want some vines, some greenery to be embroidered on the front little pocket that comes away from the bag itself, and then I want some florals and more greenery embroidered on the little back part behind the pocket. I'm going to be marking out leaves and rough shapes for where I want all of the vines and the stems to go. Again, this pen is super forgiving, and if you find yourself not really wanting to follow the guides that you've sketched out, the great news is you don't have to. They kind of serve as suggestions rather than areas that you have to embroider over. So first up, I'm going to go in with one of the greens that I'm going to use in this design. For every one of these stitches that I'm doing today, I'm going to only be using 2 strands of embroidery thread, which means that I need to separate 2 strands of thread away from the remaining 4. Each embroidery skein will come with 6 really small individual strands clumped together to make one thicker strand, and to achieve neat, dainty stitches, you need to separate this into smaller strand quantities. After you've threaded your needle and you've made a knot in the opposite end so the thread doesn't travel through the fabric when you make your first stitch, make sure to pop your finger protectors on, and it is time to start stitching. For all of the stems and all of the vines in this this project, we're going to be using the couch stitch, which basically consists of some relatively long stitches that are couched and anchored at certain parts to make sure that they curve and resemble a stem. I love a couch stitch. I think it looks a lot more cohesive and it flows much better than a bunch of back stitches, which a lot of embroidery artists use when they are embroidering a curvy stem or a vine. I prefer to do slightly longer stitches and then anchor these wherever I want the bend to be. Of course, if you prefer to do a bunch of back stitches, that's absolutely your choice. You can do those for the stems and for the vines. I find this way to be quicker and I do prefer how it looks overall. To stitch all of the leaves in this embroidery project, we're going to be using satin stitches, which are basically just clusters of straight stitches that overlap each other to create a fuller shape. In other embroidery projects, I use the lazy daisy stitch to create leaves, but I really love how full and almost blocky these leaves look. They look a little bit more realistic than lazy daisy stitched leaves. They do, however, take a little bit longer. For some of these leaves, I use 6, 7, sometimes 8 satin stitches, and that's because I am only using a thread strand density of 2. If you did want to spend less time embroidering these leaves, because there are quite a few leaves on the vines that we're going to stitch a little bit later, you could just rethread your needle with a strand density of 3 or 4. The leaves will look a little less dainty and manicured, but the project itself won't take you as long to complete. I did want this embroidery tutorial to be super in-depth. I personally am a really visual learner, and when I'm watching beginner-friendly tutorials on other crafts, I like seeing how the artist handles certain things during the tutorial, especially when they don't make as many cuts to the footage. So I'm trying to keep in as much of this tutorial as possible, even though I'm not going to be able to yap and chat for the entire time, because I think there's about 45 minutes of footage right now, and I've edited that down as much as I really want to. I do want you guys to be able to see how I handle when the thread tangles, if it knots at all, because all of that is interesting and it's kind of like pertinent to know if you are going to start an embroidery project yourself. Here I'm just going to show you how to tie off and secure your thread within the bag. You're going to want to take your needle and loop it within some of the inside stitches a couple of times, and then do that 2 to 3 more times, but in those loops make some knots. It's a little bit hard to explain, but I'm glad that I have the video to show you guys. It's super simple and it's really foolproof. I use this technique on all of my embroidery projects and I never have thread coming loose. So as you can see, I've embroidered 4 of the stems above the pocket and a few leaves with this darker green color, and now it's time to move on to the vines on the pocket itself. We're going to be using exactly the same technique: couch stitches for the vines themselves and then satin stitches for the leaves. For the leaves on this vine, I'm making them a little more dainty. I think I'm only doing 2 to 3 satin stitches for each leaf. And the guides that I sketched out for myself are really helpful here, just for the rough size of the leaves and to know exactly what direction to stitch them in for the best end result. Again, I'm just going to show you how to tie off and secure your thread. Since it's a little harder on this pocket, there's less room to work with. Loop your needle inside some of those inner stitches and then do it a couple more times and make knots in those loops. This is how the bag's looking after stitching the stems, the leaves and the vines with the darker green colour. And now I'm going in with that lighter green colour. Again, I'm using 2 strands, don't forget to split your thread. And I'm going to be stitching the remaining vines, leaves and stems with this colour. If you want to use a couple more green colours, I think that would look fantastic on a design like this. I was trying to keep it relatively simple with these 2 green colours, but realistically there would be a bunch of different green hues if you were embroidering realistic florals and greenery. So if you want to go all out and use 5 to 6 different colors, especially if you're doing a more involved design across the entire bag, I would 100% recommend some more colored greens. The process for the rest of the vines, the stems and the leaves are exactly the same as the techniques that we used with the darker green. The only thing that's slightly different with the leaves on these vines is that I'm making them a little more bulky and a little longer for a bit more variation within the design, but I'm just following the sketch that I made earlier and I'm not really doing anything too different other than elongating those satin stitches and adding a few more of them to make the leaves a bit bulkier. It's a little more challenging to stitch the vines that are close to the sides of the pocket since there's less room to work with and to get your needle up and through the pocket without snagging on the fabric behind it or to the side of the pocket, so just keep that in mind. You'll find that it's easier to work with the same color thread and continue stitching with that color until you have stitched everything that you would like to be that color. Otherwise, you will be switching out your thread color a lot and this project will take much longer. For example, as you can see, I've stitched everything in the dark green. Now I'm stitching everything in this lighter green, as opposed to stitching one flower at a time where I would stitch the stem, then switch out the thread color for what I want for the flower color, if that makes sense. Using the same thread to stitch everything you want that color in one go will make the project pass much quicker. When you have to move from one area of the bag to another when using the same thread color, instead of cutting it off and knotting your thread and rethreading it, you can just couch your needle within some of the inner stitches on your way to the next area to keep your stitching neat and to make sure there's no loose, unsecured thread within the bag. Since this is a pocket, you're probably going to be putting things into the pocket. You don't want your embroidery thread to snag on anything. Again, I'm just showing you how to tie off and secure your thread within the bag. I think this is the third or fourth time that I'm showing you now, but it is super important. You don't want to spend a bunch of time embroidering, getting your stitches right, making sure everything is neat, to then not tie off and secure your thread properly and have everything unravel. That would just be a nightmare. Okay, so once you are done stitching all of the stems and the leaves, give yourself a pat on the back. That was the largest part of this process. Now we're going to move on to adding a little bit of color, except the first thread I'm going to be using is white, and I'm going to be stitching some flower petals. The great thing about these flower petals is it's exactly the same technique that we used for all of the leaves. I'm just using 2 strands of this white thread, and I'm using the satin stitch again. I didn't sketch out these petals, you absolutely can, and I do advise you do sketch out some kind of shape for the florals that you want to embroider. I just knew exactly where I wanted them to go and how big I wanted them to be, so I did freehand these. And yeah, as I said, they're just satin stitches, and I think I do 6 to 7, maybe even 8 stitches for each petal, and they all just meet in the same place. I stitch from the outer part of the petal to the inner part of the petal, and in the center we're going to be adding some pollen a little bit later, so you can leave a small tiny bare circle in the center of all of these petals. This flower is supposed to resemble a daisy, and we're also going to be stitching a smaller version of it on the little offshoot branch that we embroidered earlier. I don't think I said this earlier, but feel free to copy this design. If you don't feel like sketching out a design with the erasable embroidery marker, there are some stick and stitch stickers that you can get from Amazon, from eBay. I'll have a couple linked in the description of this video, and they also disappear when they come into contact with water. You can peel them off and stick them onto your bag and get stitching if you don't fancy sketching a design out yourself. I totally understand that might sound a little bit daunting. These ready-made designs can be really helpful, and I do love how they just disappear when you submerge the sticky paper in water. I'm going to use that same white embroidery thread to embroider some French knots onto the lighter green stems that have leaves. You'll notice that I left one of the stems without leaves, and we'll be adding some accents to this in a little bit. But right now with this white thread, I'm just going in and adding 2 to 3 French knots on each of these stems, just below and above some of the leaves that I already stitched, just to add a couple of accents and break up the monotony of the green. Next, I'm going in with a pink color that kind of matches the little straps on this bag, and I'm going to be using the Lazy Daisy stitch to embroider some tulip looking flowers. These are the easiest tulips you could ever embroider. I'm just doing 3 small Lazy Daisy stitches, all aiming up towards the sky like tulip petals do. I do love the Lazy Daisy stitch so much because if you wanted to, you can also fill it with a straight stitch and it will look more like a filled petal. But since these stitches are so small that I'm doing for these little tulips, they kind of look filled anyway, and I'm just going to leave them how they are once I'm done stitching all 3 petals. You want the bases of them all to attach to the stem that you stitched earlier. They should all kind of converge in the same place for a really cohesive, neat looking flower. When you're on your way to the other flower on the other side of the bag, don't forget to couch your needle and kind of tuck your thread in on your way there to make sure there's no loose thread inside the bag. And while you still have this pink color threaded onto your needle, it's time to add some accents onto that naked little vine that I mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to be adding a bunch of French knots onto this vine. Okay, so maybe not a bunch. I think maybe I add like 20 to 25 max, but I kind of want it to give wisteria almost, like a little budded vine growing in the spring. Maybe these buds would turn into like blooming flowers or something, but I'm just doing little clusters of French knots. And to adjust the size of your French knot, just adjust the number of times you wrap your thread around your needle. So I'm doing 3 wraps around the needle sometimes, 2 wraps around the needle other times. It just depends on how big I want that particular cluster of French knots to be. And do these French knots all the way down the vine. Vary the size of your clusters and the size of your French knots themselves. And it sounds relatively simple, but I think it looks really effective once it's done. Now I'm going to thread my needle with this purpley blue, 2 strands again. Remember, we're using 2 strands of thread for every single part of this embroidery project. And on these stems, I'm going to be doing more satin stitches, the exact same technique we used for the petals of the daisy flowers and for all of the leaves we've stitched onto stems and vines in this project. These petals I kind of want to resemble lavender, but not really. This is its own floral design, I guess. This isn't really resembling any kind of real flower. The end result is really cute and it's pretty simple since we should have mastered the satin stitch by now. We've done like 50 of them so far in this project, and I'm just filling up the little sketches that I made earlier. They're a little thicker than some of the leaves that we did on the vines, so maybe doing 5 to 6 elongated satin stitches for some of these petals. Next, I'm going to rethread my needle with 2 more strands of the white thread, and I'm making some French knots just to add a couple of accents onto those little purpley blue leaves. And then some more French knots. I hope you guys are not too tired of the French knots, but basically the same kind of cluster technique that you did for the pink buds on the vine on the pocket of this bag. We're going to be using that same technique and adding some French knots onto this stem and this little branch offshoot. Again, you can vary the size of your French knots and the size of your clusters. If you wanted to, you could completely hide the branches with French knots and make it look very full and puffy. Next, I'm going to be stitching kind of like an upside down tulip, but really it's a flower that's like growing towards the sky with its petals facing downward, and the pollen will be sitting on top of the petals. So some more lazy daisy stitches here, just 3, the same that we did with the tulips, but the petals are facing a different direction. Once you're done stitching those petals, we're going to use this same colour and stitch the pollen of the daisies we stitched earlier with some French knot stitches, just 1 in the centre of each flower. For the smaller flower on the offshoot branch, I wrap the thread around the needle once, and then for the slightly larger flower, I wrap the thread around the needle twice. And for some reason my camera didn't catch this, but I also add a French knot stitch just on the offshoot branch underneath the yellow flower we just stitched. And then lastly, I'm using this warm toned brown color, 2 strands of it again, remember 2 strands for everything in this project. And I'm doing a little French knot stitch with this color just at the apex of those yellow lazy daisies that we just stitched for the pollen of this flower. Once you're done stitching and you no longer need the lines of the guide that you sketched out earlier with your embroidery marker, take a little water spritz bottle and saturate the area that you sketched over in water so that the blue marker disappears. I like to be quite liberal with my water usage, and then I dab off excess water and then I respray it. Sometimes this marker is a little bit stubborn depending on how hard you press on the fabric, and it doesn't want to leave sometimes, so you might have to do this a couple times, letting it dry in between, but don't worry, the marker will eventually disappear. And leave your bag to dry in a well ventilated area. When you come back to it, it should look a little something like this. I really hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. This was so much fun for me to film. As soon as this bag came in the mail, like I said earlier in the video, I dropped everything and I started to film this tutorial. This is one of the cutest things I've ever embroidered. I absolutely love it. I actually want to get this bag in every single color. I do want to keep this bag, but me and my husband are relocating in a couple of months and I have to be really brutal with my closet right now. I'm not allowed to keep things that I wouldn't use on a weekly basis, so I think I might have to sell this beauty. If I do, the link to it will be in the description of this video. I love doing seasonal embroidery projects and this bag is giving spring in the best way. Again, thank you so much for watching, especially if you've gotten to the end. I do really hope that you found this helpful, and if you haven't already, I would so appreciate it if you would like and maybe share this video. And if you haven't subscribed already, what the heck are you doing? No, I'm just kidding. If you do like hand embroidery tutorials, embroidery related content, small business related content, you might enjoy it over here on my channel. I would absolutely love to have you. And yeah, again, thank you so much for watching. I think that's the 8th time I've said that. I will see you again in my next video, and yeah, thanks again. Bye.